Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. I'm Professor Christopher Jane Miller, and more importantly, we're joined today by my colleague and wonderful guest, Professor Tine Vekemans at Ghent University. We are very happy to interview Professor Vekemans about her new book, which you can't see, but I'm holding up for her to see on the Zoom, and she's holding up too, Digital and Diaspora. I had a recent opportunity to read this book cover to cover, which is always a luxury in academia to be able to do so. And I'm really excited to talk about this book with Professor Vekemans. Tine, it's so good to have you here. Before we dive into the book and talk about what you do and what you study there at Ghent, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background, who you are, and what brings you into Jain Studies.
All right. Thanks, Chris. So what brings me to Jain Studies? I did my BA and a first MA in Indian Languages and Cultures, which is a study program that still exists and where I work now at Ghent University. The reason I started those studies and not something entirely different was really a love of language. But although my love of language is still there, throughout my studies, I kind of veered more towards the social sciences and politics and cultural studies. So it's also in that direction that I did my MA dissertation. And after finishing that MA, I dabbled a little bit in an MA in global studies. After finishing university, I got a job as an interpreter. I worked as a social assistant and as an intercultural advisor. So all of that was more in kind of that branch of that type of professions, where I got a lot of chances to speak to really interesting people, people often with complex migration backgrounds, people carrying a lot of cultural baggage from one part of the world to another. And although I find that really enriching and I feel really grateful for that experience, for all of these people being so open and sharing their experiences with me. What I missed in my professional life was the opportunity to really delve deep into this and really think through these processes of globalization, of migration, of the impact of all of this on the way people experience their culture, their religion, their family life, all of that. So thinking that that is what I missed, I went back to the university with the hopes of starting a career in research. And I'm very happy and grateful to have gotten the opportunity to start a PhD. Now, why then Jainism? Being born in Antwerp, in Wilrijk, where there is a sizable Jain community, and having studied under quite a few professors whose specialization in research was actually tied to Jainism, I knew about Jains. I was, throughout my studies, I'd been introduced to Jain philosophy, some Jain texts, but I'd never really looked into applying my passion for all things globalization and migration to the case of the Jains. But then coming back to the university, that's exactly what Professor Eva de Klerk and I devised, a project which built on this decades-long expertise in Jain studies already there at Ghent University, but also with my passion for doing social science research and looking into migration. So that is where we are now. The book that we will be discussing is the product, mostly the product of my PhD research. But after finishing and obtaining my PhD, I also started research as a postdoctoral fellow, also at Ghent University, funded by various agencies, and looking into Jain migration history and memory. And since 2022, I hold the Acharya Mahapragya Chair for Jain Studies there as well. So that in a nutshell is me.
Well, I'm so happy to have you on the podcast, and I'm excited about your work. And you and I share a kind of passion for the social, scientific, ethnographic, really immersion in Jain studies. And so I was particularly excited to interview you about this book, which is so much about those things and much more based on the background you just told us. So let me begin by asking you about the title of this book. There's two parts here, digital and diaspora, and I'll hold it up in case we do a video with this later, right? And the subtitle is Intertwined Frontiers of Contemporary Jainism. Intertwined. Okay, so my first question really about this book for our listeners, and what I found great about it, is why you studied these two particular intertwined categories, digital and diaspora. Why these two? Tell us more about that.
Well, from the point of view of Jain studies, there may not necessarily be an automatic connection in people's minds between the digital realm and diaspora, as in a collective of communities living outside India, in our case, right? But in the study of migration, there has long been this hypothesis that the new connectivity and the ease of exchange and content production, which we see now that digital media is pretty much available to almost everyone, almost everywhere, is especially significant in the lives of people who have migrated from one place to another. And it's kind of that hypothesis that I wanted to unpack in the case of Jainism, that I wanted to kind of put front and central in my exploration of how Jainism develops, how Jains experience being Jain in these communities outside India. Of course, I got more than I bargained for, because as all my research does all the time, this turned out to be a really big question to tackle, and to tackle it well and to go in depth, it required a lot of more broader research into how exactly the digital works, what kind of sources and resources are available digitally on Jainism, but also how these Jain communities outside of India, how they work, and how Jainism in general kind of, what's there? What is it made up out of? How does it function? So in that sense, it became a really broad project, which is also why you say, well, your book touches upon all of these things and more. Yes, it's because it was a very broad research. But in a nutshell, I found that both the digital and diaspora, even if you disentangle them, can both kind of be seen as frontiers of contemporary Jainism, as kind of spaces of experimentation, spaces of change, of trial and error. Just that is really interesting to me. And then they are also in quite a few ways intimately connected to each other, which is what then at least part of the book delves into, the mechanisms of why the digital has a specific relevance to the diaspora and the other way around.
Yeah, I really appreciated that. As I read the title, you never judge a book by its cover, but I wanted to know, what is it that connects these two? Why are they intertwined, digital and diaspora? And I know you said it's kind of broad, but I really felt like in the book, the way you theorize it, it made sense to me that we cannot think about these two worlds separately. They're intertwined, so to speak. And the diaspora is using digital resources, as are those who live in South Asia as well, of course. And the way that you weaved the two together did make quite a bit of sense to me. And so tell us more about the methods that you used, your ethnographic. There's ethnography in there. There's a lot of analysis of websites. I found it so helpful and so useful for me personally to understand the kind of digital landscape that the diaspora is using. So you collected a lot of data, you did interviews, there's so much in here. Can you tell us about some of the kind of ethnographic and anthropological methods that you used to study both the digital spaces and the diasporic spaces? Where did you go? Who did you meet? Tell us more.
Everywhere and everyone. No, so as I said, I got more than I bargained for, starting from my initial research question and the setup of the project, because to really get into how Jains use digital spaces outside India, it means that you need to know what digital spaces there are that Jains might visit. So I did a lot of sometimes really annoying, very repetitive research just Googling and finding out which websites there are, which apps there are, which social media groups that are accessible, what they are about, who talks about Jainism, in which context online, which is a lot of work. Very interesting, but also because you said, well, I find it really insightful to see what that landscape looks like. It's also an ever-changing landscape. So I did that throughout the running time of my project. I did that 3 times, 2 times of which are discussed in the book. And you already saw that if there's 2 or 3 years in between your data points, it changes rapidly. Websites disappear, others pop up. For example, in the first data gathering period, I had quite a few forums, like discussion groups and forums still, where I then went and looked at, okay, how many posts a day, who talks to whom, and really fine-grained analysis, only to notice 2.5 years later that they were almost all dead and gone, which is interesting because you would think, okay, don't these people discuss anymore? Then now, of course they do, only everything's shifted to WhatsApp, where as a researcher, I find it very difficult to still study it because you need to be invited into these groups on WhatsApp, which wasn't true for most forums. So it changes a lot, requiring repeat research of this entire structure again and again. So that was thing 1. Then I had an insight of, okay, what kind of information is out there? So now the next question became, how do people then use it? Because it's one thing to say that there's like a lot of websites offering Jain vegan recipes. It gives you an inkling that this might be important to some people, but you can't extrapolate from that tons of Jains are going vegan. You need to have your evidence in the other direction. Then I started to kind of toy with the question, how do Jains use these resources? Which becomes the question, how do Jains living in communities outside India, how do they experience Jainism? How do they practice Jainism? What kind of information do they need? What sort of things do they do? Assuming that there would be overlap, but also vast differences between different communities in different places, I did my ethnographic fieldwork in Antwerp in Belgium, in London and a little bit in Leicester in the UK, and then in different places in the US. So I have this comparison of these 3 different contexts also in the book. And everywhere I went, and then we come to ethnographic methods in the field, I was present. I tried to participate whenever that was like a plausible thing to do. I tried to observe as much as I possibly could, because I think it's really important to not just do interviews, but to also really kind of observe what's going on, what a typical Jain day looks like in these places. And then I talk a lot, and I also try to listen even more. Now, the conversations I did were, as you can guess, really broad on how people experience the self, their community, their family in the context they're in, how they experienced moving to another country, or in the case of 2nd, 3rd generation Jains, how they view this history of migration in their family and what their relationship is to India, if there's any relationship there at all. So that means that in my field notes and my interview transcripts, you will find information on digital media and its relevance in people's lives, but you will also find recipes and bhajan lyrics and personal interpretations of karma theory. All of that is part of the research which underlies the book. But, in the end, after the recipes and the songs, I did end up asking people about their use of digital media, and often in a kind of circuitous way. I would often ask, if you are looking for information, if you want to know something on Jainism, where would you look? If people were board members of organizations, which I also try to include in my respondents list, well, how does this organization seek to utilize digital media? Do they have a social media platform? Do they have a webmaster? What kind of information is on there? Do they do any of their logistics through digital media, et cetera, et cetera? So I did speak to webmasters. I asked dozens of people to talk me through their phones, any apps with particular relevance to Jainism, or the WhatsApp groups that they were in, the topics of those. But the broad approach was really key for me. So that means it's underlying this book, there's an ethnography of half a dozen Jain communities dotted all over, Belgium, UK, and the US, and kind of large scale digital media, more mixed methods research on the state of online Jainism.
Yeah, one of the kind of benefits for me of reading the book was not only getting a snapshot of the digital landscape, which, as you say, changes. It's constantly changing. You did, I think, 2013 and 2017 were your major snapshots that are in the book. Of course, and we'll talk about, it's pre-pandemic, right? So we'll talk about that later. But the other thing that I got a snapshot of was the actual landscape, the actual social landscape in these three places, in Belgium, in the UK, and in North America. I'm more familiar with the North American setting, and I got even more familiar recently with the UK setting, and I haven't really gotten into the Antwerp setting, but the snapshot that you provide there provides so much for us to consider about what's going on in these Jain communities in the diaspora in a level of detail that I haven't seen before. And I think part of that, as you say, is being open when you're in the field. You go with these methods, you go with these ideas of how it's going to be, and then you just have all these experiences and they show you other things. And so for those wanting to understand the diaspora, we get a lot of questions about the diaspora. How many people are there? Where are they? What do they do? I felt like your book really answered those questions really well, especially in those major diasporic areas. So just kind of riffing on your methods there, I think that it resulted in you gathering a lot of interesting information for people who want to know about the Jain diaspora. And so highly recommend, especially in those three particular areas. So within the book, as you were going through and you did your research, I noted that you identified 4 particular roles that the digital connections play in the community, right? In the diaspora community. And those were old, new, virtual, and global. Those 4 roles that you identified. So can you tell us what you mean by these 4 roles of old, new, virtual, and global? Who in particular is really creating these digital spaces?
Okay. So I'm going to try to park that second part of your question. If I do forget it, you remind me. So there is an article, and by now I think it's at least 15 years old, by 2 sociologists, Hiller and Franz, I think they're called. And the article is New Ties, Old Ties, and Lost Ties. It does not really look at sort of our contemporary digital landscape, but what it actually deals with is the social network of people who have recently migrated. So it deals with new ties as in creating a new social network in the place that people now live. Old ties, which are the connections, in our case with the Jains, and mostly to India, to the community they were part of, but have now physically left behind. And then the article deals with lost ties, which are essentially old ties that are no longer connected, that can no longer be revived in that sense. Now, because I wanted to look at the effect of the increased digital engagements on our Jain's practices, but also just social network, I thought it was kind of a neat framework. And I looked at the impact of digital media on establishing new ties, and that's both on an individual level. If you're new somewhere, find a couple of friends with similar interests, but also on kind of more a Jain community and organizational level, how these new communities are developed, how they grow, how they settle in a way. And then under old ties, of course, that refers to previous places of settlement, which for most Jains is India. And there also we see that a lot of people told me like, now with WhatsApp, it's much easier to just kind of ask a question from a cousin. And we actually, people say we socialize with people in India, with people of our community in India, in ways that we weren't able to before. And then before means like point at the time they speak, like 5 or 10 years ago. So there's a clear impact there. And then I nixed the lost ties, but I added the virtual ties and then global ties. Now, virtual ties are a really real kind of social connection, but based purely on a shared virtual digital engagement, meaning that geographical location doesn't really enter into it, or only as a tangential factor. Virtual ties can be a membership of Facebook group or a discussion forum on the study of Jainism in general, or a specific interest in a part of the tradition, or even a shared engagement in a vegan recipe group or an East African recipe group, which is also very common. And then the global, is a bit of a special case in the sense that for me, these global connections, they kind of emerged from the other three. Digital media made it differently easy for people to set up new networks, but also to sustain their older ones, to bring them into the present. They also allow for these virtual kind of connections based on interest alone, irrespective of geographic location. And because of all the three, they help create this feeling of being global, of a global Jainism. They're not the only factor in this by a long shot, because there's a lot of organizations, a lot of groups, both in India and in the diaspora, that kind of want to foster this idea of Jainism as being a global thing. However, I feel that digital media have really enhanced this because of the cumulative effect of these three types of ties. So which question did I park? Who creates the content?
Yeah, sorry, that was a follow-up question. I meant to park myself, but so the next question I had was, who is creating these digital spaces?
There again, the fact that these two things, the digital and diaspora, are kind of intertwined, comes to the fore, because if you look at the resources, especially like the bigger websites with a lot of information on Jainism, these are disproportionately diasporic when you look at who creates the content. Now, there can be different reasons for this, and there are different reasons to this. I had the pleasure of speaking to quite a few web designers and developers of this content that said, well, yeah, it's moving to another country, which made me think like, oh, this kind of resource should be there. So that can be a motivator to kind of start working on a website on Jainism, combining Jain resources. A very big one is also the want or the need to make information and resources available to younger generations, which are not brought up in a classical setting, the rural village in Gujarat or Rajasthan, where these things can be taught by elderly family members or passing sadhus or sadhvis, to make this available. What we also see, and that's just in general, not just on Jainism or even in websites belonging to cultural or religious groups, is that because the internet was first made widely available in the US, there is still a bias towards websites hosted and developed in the US, which also in a sense explains why these specifically North American websites are so findable and so popular. So it all adds to their prominence. But in general, also, if you look at smaller scale things like discussion groups and Facebook pages, it's clear that there is disproportionate engagement of the Jains living outside India with Jainism in the digital realm.
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise to me to find that out. But the way you described it and the reasons for it help it make sense for me, especially with the emphasis on English language being the kind of winning language in SEO and search engines, Google and all this.
Yeah, because in the beginning, I thought this can't be true. Because there's a lot of people in India developing things as well, developing digital tools and websites. However, when it comes to findability, when it comes to a Jain or anyone anywhere in the world Googling things, for the longest time, English language websites, or at least kind of Unicode font using websites, were always in the top results. So that's the things that people end up with. That's what you click on because that's the most obvious, which in a way kind of makes it difficult to say to which extent the fact of living outside India in the diaspora is like a motivator to really generate a lot of content, because how the algorithms work within Google search also just gives a very kind of weird view of what is there. However, very early on, I decided to keep on thinking about this in a kind of philosophical, conceptual way, but to also just realize that in practice, the Google algorithm is what counts because it decides what people find. And I think it was in Ohio, in Columbus, that someone told me, like, okay, when we're looking for information, which we do, we have questions about Jainism, different aspects of it. A lot of people will tell you differently, but us regular Jains, and that is a verbatim quote, we just Google stuff. So it matters. It is hugely important, this algorithm. But especially for websites, it has for a very long time kind of obscured things in Indic fonts, in Indic languages, and promoted English language content.
Yeah, with the rise of artificial intelligence, and we know there's artificial intelligence already working behind the scenes on delivering to us what it is that we're seeing in those results, it also makes us wonder for the sequel of your book that we can talk about later, to what extent that this is shaping the perceptions of Jainism globally, especially with regard to what you said, with this kind of approach to try to create a universal Jainism, so to speak, that is so prevalent, especially in my experience and from where I read in your book, in the diasporic setting, that you don't necessarily find as strong coming out of India, so to speak. So with that in mind, I was wondering what differentiates, and you could say more from your book, both the digital and actual physical social landscape of the diaspora in the UK, in Belgium, and in the UK, and in North America. You have these three different places where you go, very broadly speaking, that probably share things and overlap in terms of that universality, so to speak. But I also suspect that there are a lot of things that were extremely unique, and only out of my own experience of being in those different places, I've experienced that, but it wasn't my project. I'm curious if you would tell us more about what makes these culturally different spaces so different from one another in light of this attempt to kind of create a universal Jainism. I'm sure there's a tension between these things.
I'm sure there is. Just looking at kind of the actual diaspora communities, the actual communities of Jains outside India, and leaving aside for a moment the digital, there are obvious differences. When you arrive in one of these places and when you go to community events, from the get-go, you kind of feel like, okay, there's a difference in doing this. There's a difference in atmosphere. And a lot of that depends on one side, on sort of demography, how many Jains are there in how big an area, what kind of area does an organization or a center service, how many organizations are there, what's the organizational landscape, and then also what's the history of the particular Jain community in that place. So if you look at Antwerp, that's in Belgium, there's a community of 1,200, 1,500 Jains there. They're almost all Gujarati. They're almost all in some way or form involved in diamond trade, and they're almost all from kind of the same part of Gujarat. There's one big Jain organization there, and that's kind of it. And the temple that has been built is part of that organization, of the GCCA. This gives an entirely different vibe and also entirely different logistics from a place like London, where you have a dozen Jain organizations, some geared specifically towards one subgroup, but there's also a lot of them that are open to anyone who might be interested, and they work at the same time in different parts of London, but mostly in North London. So it's a lot of Jain stuff happening on a relatively small area. But then there's about 25,000 Jains in Greater London, so they have like a constituency to do this. Their background is kind of a mix. A lot of the Jains in London have a migration background in East Africa, so they've been away from India. These families have been away from India for a lot longer. The link with India for many of them is further. It's less present in their daily lives, especially compared to Antwerp, where people very often still go back to India a couple of times a year. right? Even with their family, yearly pilgrimages to Palitana are definitely a thing in Antwerp. Not so much for these Jains with a background in East Africa in London. They also are kind of engaged in much more of a variety of professions. So it's a very different feel. And in the US, it's kind of in between, in the sense that often in one area you have one Jain center, which is the way that it has historically developed in the US, which is in sort of the less busy places open like 1 or 2 days a week when there's activities, and all the Jains in the surrounding area do or do not then come there, irrespective of their particular sectarian or even regional background, right? In America, in the US, and well, in North America, I should say, you have Jaina as a kind of umbrella organization, kind of enveloping most of these local Jain organizations and trying to kind of piece together a brand, if I can say that. I don't mean this in a negative way, of North American Jainism with some best practices, etc. So there is a real difference between these communities, and it's also reflected in their digital footprint, so to speak. In places where there's only really one Jain organization and the community is kind of stable, there's not that many new arrivals, right? It's less of a priority often to have like a website where you post all of your activities and all of the practical information about your activities, because it's just not necessary. Because all of the people who need to know that, okay, on Sunday, that's the place I go, and then I will see what the activity is when we get there. Or there's a WhatsApp group where everyone who's a member is. And there's not really a reason to have an elaborate website. Some places do have one, but that is often, when there's an enthusiastic webmaster on the committee, then they'll have one. But if that person then leaves, it's very clear that it's not necessarily a priority. In London, where there's that many organizations and a lot of people kind of passing through or on travels or studies or temporary work placements, for a lot of our organizations, this digital presence, this footprint is key, because they do need to attract their audience, because on every possible day, there's multiple options for you to do something Jain, which means that you can choose. So you need to know what's there. And you might be new, so it should be relatively easy for you to kind of Google, like, okay, what's going on in the Jain department in Greater London this Saturday? So where in London you have a lot of websites and Facebook pages with all of the events nicely listed, in Antwerp you have a blackboard at the temple with, in Gujarati, the timings and the plan for the next couple of weeks. And for their purpose, it works perfectly. So there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of differences. There is some overlap, obviously, but you can kind of feel the difference both in the way the communities and the organizations themselves function and in the digital footprint they have.
Yeah, and I think once again, this illustrates how important it is to understand digital and diaspora together, as you're saying, because it sounds to me like, from reading your book as well, that the digital worlds that exist for these three major diasporic communities really reflect the social reality of those diasporic communities and serve particular needs that are based on the reality on the ground and what you're experiencing in the temples, at the centers. And I can see, I haven't been to Antwerp, but I trust you for reading your book, that it's a more confined, smaller community with a very set focus and tradition. And so they don't need all of that. And I've been to the UK and I've been pulled all over and had so much fun visiting so many different places because there's so much going on, right? And there's a sort of similar thing in the US. It's just spread out over a greater distance. And so it really helped me understand why the internet and digital worlds and everything are used in particular ways in these three different places. So I think people will get a lot out of that, to see how digital and diaspora are so uniquely intertwined in each place. And I also wanted to mention for the readers that there is on one of the pages, there's a really nice, simple graph that you made where you give a sort of picture of the governance of the three different worlds that we're talking about. So you have in the US, this kind of umbrella, Jaina, that is kind of a container for most of the organizations. And then in the UK, there's less of a centralized kind of governance. there, although there are some central players as you show. And then in Antwerp, it's really, as you say, kind of more one basic central community, so to speak. And so there's really nice illustrations in this book as well that stick in your mind and help you remember what the social reality looks like. And so it shows really how unique and how different each of these spaces are. So one of the things that also showed me going through this is that as Jain communities travel around the world, and you do discuss a bit about Africa as well, but as Jain communities migrate, they change. They change their practices, they change their temples, they change their food, they change a lot of things change when any culture moves. And of course, the Jain tradition is part of that. They're trying to adapt their principles and their worldview in a new space, in a new cultural space. And so one of the things that is oft highly debated, especially in the diaspora, is ritual, right? And how does ritual work? And you often hear some people say, well, we don't need ritual, others perform ritual on a daily basis. I don't have any stake in this game or in this argument or in this debate, but I did find it interesting that you discuss digital ritual and what it means, how the real world of ritual intersects with the digital world of ritual, and use the terms ritual transfer and ritual dynamics to explain this. So what do you mean by ritual transfer and ritual dynamics, and how do they apply to the digital world and the real world of diasporic Jains?
Okay, well, I'll tell you how that kind of part of the book came about. I was looking for what websites and what digital resources were there on Jainism, and I found not a lot, but 3 websites, all 3 at that point hosted from India, that offered something called variations on digital arti, online arti, digital puja. And they were rather rudimentary, but they existed. But again, from their existence, you can't really infer whether people actually practice this. It would be interesting. But they kind of caught my eye, they caught my interest, and I thought, okay, let's have a closer look at that. And then when I started my fieldwork, I also asked people if they'd seen these things, and then if they said no, which many people did, I kind of showed it, like, okay, how would you react to this? What is this, right? And it's in reading, in looking for background information and background theory to kind of support this exploration, that I found a couple of articles, because this is actually not my term, ritual transfer. It's a well-developed theory by now in the sociology of religion, which I found helpful in making sense of this. And when I was then years later sort of writing up the book, I found it even more helpful. So what ritual transfer or ritual dynamics actually says is that rituals, in the broadest possible meaning, do in fact change as the context in which they are performed changes. This and that this combination of changes in the context and then in ritual or religious performance, that they are very helpfully researched in unison. Now, this might not sound very mind-blowingly innovative, but actually, and for me personally, and I think for a lot of people studying religion and culture, it's a kind of good to be reminded of this, because there is this long-held belief, both with scholars but also among adherents of different religious traditions, that religion is something fixed and religious practices are something which are supposed to be change averse, right? They're supposed to kind of remain the same. And this entire literature around ritual transfer is very, very good to point out that it really usually isn't. That change is, to be expected, that it's not an anomaly that practices change, that's a kind of, it's the usual way things go. Specifically regarding those websites where you could do puja, the people I talked to then, who I confronted with this, usually said, well, it might be nice to use if you're teaching someone about puja, but it's not the same. People would find ways to say, well, it's not the same. But then a couple of years later, COVID, and all of a sudden there were tons of live streams of rituals, of puja, of arti, and they were attended. And even so, people will say, well, it's technically not the same. But all of a sudden, it was absolutely a practice that people engaged in. So I find it really a helpful thing to think with, this ritual transfer, as a reminder that change is not the exception. And I think that is good to keep in mind.
Yeah, and that's what makes our job so interesting, right? It's our job to kind of see where those major important changes happen. And so I found that both the relationship between the online and how it changed during the pandemic, as you mentioned, and just the notion that you're pointing out that, of course, rituals in general change, but so too do they within the Jain tradition as well, as they move around into these various contexts.
Yeah, and sometimes these changes are really, subtle, but it's good to keep an eye open for them. And it's also, I think, sometimes quite challenging, but very important to not sort of make value judgments about the fact that something is an innovation or something has changed. It's good to keep it neutral and say, well, change is what we do. That makes it a living tradition.
Absolutely. And one of the things I remember is you describing the temple space, the way the temple spaces are constructed for ritual use, so to speak, in different places, and how there's attempts in particular places, especially in the diaspora, to be more ecumenical and not sectarian, and try to make a space where however you perform your puja, whether you're Shvetambara or Digambara, the diasporic spaces try to kind of make a container for that kind of ritual praxis. Tell me this. Here's a question I have. Is there ever a time, and I think you raised this in your book, when Jains would not use digital spaces? When is the diaspora, or just in general, when might we not find Jains using digital spaces, or not find it necessary, or explicitly not necessary?
That is a really sort of personal thing, of course. Because, if you broaden up that space, well, Chris, think about when you use your phone and when you don't. What do you use it for? And what are you like, no, that's not a place for my phone. But even so, and even though it's really this great variety between Jains and as they reply to a question like that, it's clear that for logistics, for socializing, for exchange of basic information, and for exchange of devotional images, videos, sounds, digital media are almost universally accepted. Almost. There's always exceptions. For use in direct religious practice, such as rituals, it is more complex. Before COVID, it was very clear. Most people would say, well, a thing like online dakshan, which you have the websites that I found at first in 2013 were like kind of gamified pujas, if you understand my meaning. Online dakshan kind of grew out of the fact that there were in quite a few temples security cameras. And so members of the committee could kind of go into the visuals of those cameras, which, if you pointed them right, were right at the sanctum of the temple. So it's a different kind of thing. It's not necessarily a ritual per se, because you're not performing anything. But then we know that for a lot of Jains and in a lot of South Asian traditions, just the darshan is also an act, right? So that became a more popular thing. Still, people in general, people that go to the temple for their religious practice, prefer being physically in a temple. So they would say, like, these puja, these online pujas, these websites offering that. It's nice if I'm trying to explain to my kid how you do puja, or if my mother-in-law is ill and she can't go to the temple. It might be nice for her to do this, even though people would then also say, like, well, in Jainism, as you don't have to go to the temple, it's not an obligatory practice. It might actually just be better if you can't physically go to the temple to do something else, to meditate, to study a text, to do something else, or to have your home shrine and kind of have a practice there. So when I first started writing about online ritual in Jainism, the conclusion was pretty early on. It exists, which means that it's used for something, but almost nobody seems to use it for actual ritual practice, because the social aspect isn't there. The feeling of sacredness of the purity of the temple isn't there, so it's used in different ways. And then came COVID, and then it became very clear that this acceptance at least temporarily shifted, and people did make this into a more serious part of their religious practice beyond just teaching or just kind of playing around with it. How did we get here? What do Jains use digital media for and whatnot? So actual ritual practice, not so much, although there's a ton of kind of apps and websites offering services which have something to do with that. Calendar apps, what are the tithis, when to do what, puja text apps, manuals, all of that is definitely used and definitely there. But the actual performance of rituals, most Jains are very cautious about doing that through their phones. When I discussed where Jains in different places get their information, if they have like a question on Jainism, on karma, or on why a particular food is not good to eat at a particular time, or the background of philosophy of Anekantvad or anything like that. When I asked where they got their information, I got a variety of answers, and it was very clear that Jains, lay Jains who aren't specifically involved in the study of the Jain tradition would, for a lot of things, Google. Especially the younger generations would Google, and then they would find a website like Jaina or like Jain World or Wikipedia, and kind of figure out their answer from there. And some even said that, okay, there's clear differences of opinion online, but then you can pick and choose, and maybe that's also good. Maybe that's also, and this is again verbatim, maybe that's also a kind of Syadvat. Maybe that's also a kind of Anekantvat. The more complex the question got, the less likely people are to just Google. And people who are in some way or form engaged in like the study of Jainism, because they're Pachala teachers, doesn't have to be super advanced, but because they're Pachala teachers for kids, or because that is their mode of practice, the study of text, they would be less inclined to just blindly Google. They would be more inclined to maybe talk to a local person who they accept to be knowledgeable, like a pandit, or to contact a family member, often in India, or maybe even through a family member contact a sadhu or sadhvi that they're familiar with, or read a book. And often, and that's actually really, it's smart because it shows some media criticism. Often they said, well, the thing online is you don't know what authority is behind an opinion. Because, usually there's very shabby source references and you don't know who writes, or there's no reference at all. You don't know who it is speaking. So at least with a book, this is the author. You can kind of get the background of the author. You know who you're getting the information from. So the use of digital media to find information was, on sort of a basic level, already prevalent in 2013 and has only really grown because you can get more refined information because more and more stuff has become available. Even those who prefer books, well, you have Jain e-library and so many repositories just putting these books up online. So in a sense, these sources have kind of been incorporated into the digital. But there's definitely more and less accepted ways of integrating your smartphone into your religious practice in Jainism.
Yeah, and I found that really interesting. And I think this is what I was getting at, is there may have been some spaces and things that may have seemed to always be off limits. And I think ritual is one of the ones that stands out. But, COVID changed that to some degree, as you point out. Even the things that we might consider the phone or digital spaces not useful for in the practice of Jainism, however broadly conceived, there's always seems to be a slip or something could change depending on the social context. So once again, the social context determines the use of the digital spaces. So thank you and I think your book, there's a lot of nice graphs in there and tables that show all the different uses of these various spaces. Like you've mentioned a lot of them, a lot of it with food or ritual practice, or how to perform puja and other things. There's so many different references. Parenting, I think, was in there. I'm remembering like a table that shows like there are this many websites that discuss these various activities and topics. So there's something there, so to speak, it seems, for everyone. So with all of this in mind, one of the things I was curious to hear from you, and I noted a couple things I was reading through the book, is who is this for in Jain Studies, and even broadly speaking, maybe South Asian studies and study of religion? Who is this book for, and what kind of intervention, really? I guess my question is where do you see this making an intervention in the studies that you do, Jain Studies or other allied fields?
Well, first of all, I feel really very privileged to have been able to conduct this research. So many people helped me along the way. And then I'm talking scholars, but really mainly members of the Jain community being very generous and opening up. And they've also, all of this has contributed to this being kind of the first published account, at least, of Jainism in a digital realm, which is because this change is so fast. It's kind of the baseline measurement and we're going to have to revisit and look again and see how it changed, but at least now we have a baseline. And then also because it's the first published study which compares different Jain communities outside of India in sort of great detail, not just the demographics. I feel that this is really important to show the dynamism, but also the diversity within the Jain diaspora. So combining those two, my contribution, my take-home message is to not ignore these intertwined frontiers. Because I feel that too often, and even if rationally we, and that's we as people studying Jainism, even if and when we know better, we get stuck with this concept of digital media as kind of a game and spielerij, and everyone can say anything, and it's not important to an ancient tradition like Jainism. And similarly, we get stuck, Jains at times too, with this idea that the Jain communities outside India are kind of, you know, the stagnant and the lost sheep, and they do everything that Jains would do in India, but they have less opportunities for them. Really does not give enough credit to their innovative thinking and their practices and their influence also in the direction of India. These frontiers, as I have called them, are really essential parts of contemporary Jainism. And whatever your is in studying Jainism in sort of from the 20th century onwards, you need to include them. Even if they turn out not to be central to your argument, it's not fair to not look, because this is often where the change in the experiment happens, where the direction of influence starts to turn. This is not something that you can afford not looking at. So that was the main kind of take home of the book, and I hope that came across. That together with just the awesome variety of practices and the richness of thought and practice as seen in Jainism and in the Jain diaspora in particular.
Those were some of the key major takeaways for me without having spoken to you about them in particular yet. I really think that this book helped me understand the context out of which I learned Jainism in North America, the context in which I've experienced it in particular places in Europe, and just really reinforced to me the diversity and complexity, and also, as you say, the generosity of this community, because in all these places where you go, they are really so helpful and so willing and so much, they really desire to help with the research itself. I think there's so many opportunities for more research in the diaspora, and your book really sets a really great foundation for us to launch from, especially those who are studying in history, social histories, and social sciences. So thank you for putting this together for us. I hope many people will pick up a copy of your book. It's from Aragon as the publisher. They'll be able to pick it up online. Here's a question I have for you, maybe a final question, which is your research, as we said before, is from 2013 and 2017, leading right up until the pandemic. And you make it very clear that hey, this is when I did my research. You do have a chapter at the end that talks about the future, but a lot of things happened, and we've talked about them a little bit today, during COVID-19, during the pandemic, when a lot of things went digital. and since then. And where do you see then? So I think about this has helped me understand Arihanta Institute, for example. We emerged during the pandemic. We offer a ton of online stuff. Ghent University has online graduate training, right? So online training in Jain Studies as well. Where do you, places like our institutes, Arihanta Institute, Ghent University, other organizations, what's happened, I guess, and how do we fit into this since the pandemic?
We're definitely very much co-intertwined into the diaspora and the digital, actually, with our practices. I think most scholars being scholars of Jainism outside India are based in the vicinity of some Jain diaspora community or other. And these are often our first interlocutors, even for people who study very different aspects of Jainism. Even if you're studying a philosophical text, your first interlocutor may well be a Jain living in the US or the UK. So we are in contact. Members of the Jain community come to our events. We go and we listen in to lectures organized by Jain organizations in the diaspora. So we are, just by sheer physical proximity, we're close. And then digitally, this enhances this even further. And we see a very similar process at work where Jain organizations, many of the digital practices that they developed during COVID also showed the fact that all of a sudden there was a much broader audience. The possibilities seemed, not endless, but greatly enhanced. With people in London, if you're going to take online classes anyway, why not listen in to an online class conducted in Kenya or in India? Why not have morning bhajans as live streamed from Australia in the US at the other side of the clock? Why not? And I think as scholars and working academic institutions, it was very clear that, we have something to offer, which due to geography mostly, some of our potential audience can't access. It's not practical. Even if we do prefer, in-person teaching in a fixed classroom, for some reasons, it's just such a loss to not kind of enhance that scope and invite more of the world in if they're willing to listen. So in that sense, we're very much part of the same thing. When I was doing my research, the repeat study of the websites and the online resources I did in 2017, because it had been some years since the first data points, there were new websites and new things and more things. And one of the things I then also found was myself on a Jain website, because apparently I'd been filmed giving like a short introduction somewhere. And all of a sudden, I was in my own kind of corpus, which really revealed that this is, and I think all social scientific research and ethnographic research, especially when it's conducted correctly, it's always like a co-creative process. And we always become a part of things we study and the other way around. And that perhaps, if you look at that on an institutional level, is where you could also see our online programs popping into this discussion.
Yeah, I really did find it so helpful for having background and context for understanding the digital world, and then seeing how the next chapter is kind of all of these things that emerged that you're describing after COVID-19 and that have stuck around since the pandemic, to be able to provide those spaces, as you say, where we're now able to study with people, have students in our classrooms who otherwise geographically or because of visas or all these other challenges are no longer there. The kind of the red tape has been removed on those things. So it was wonderful to speak with you, Tine, about your book. And I really do highly recommend it. It's easy to read. This is another thing I really liked about it. Easy to read in the sense that it didn't have tons of academic language in it. It was very well written. And I say that because I think both academics, I know it's been well reviewed in our field already, but also Jains in the community who want to read about the history of the diaspora and the context would really enjoy this book. So I highly recommend it to all of our listeners. Before we end, is there anything else that you would like to say that I've forgotten to ask you, or points that came up along the way?
All I wanted to add is a big thank you, Chris, for this interview, which I really enjoyed doing. And also if you're listening to this, do by all means go and find the book and read it. Let me know what you think. Take my Michami Dukadam into account, in the sense that the book is a product of research, which has been a great leap of learning and development for me as well, where I find that my interpretations and my way of thinking about this continually changed. So when I wrote up the book, I was at the point where I was, but then every day, every interview I do, every time I go and observe an event, every time I'm talking to one of my Jain friends or reading an academic paper, even that kind of nuances and further refines this thinking. But in a sense, I think we're all eternal students, and this is what we should seek, sort of again and again, the refinement of our thinking process. But you will probably be able to read that in the book as well.
Absolutely. Spoken like a true ethnographer and social scientist. So thank you so much to Professor Tine Vekemans. Once again, the book is titled Digital and Diaspora. Highly recommend that you pick it up. And thank you everyone for tuning in to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. Jai Jinendra. Bye-bye.
Jai Jinendra. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.